It's totally fine. I have a lot more stories.
That you do.
Yeah.
That you do.
Guilty as charged with the stories.
Hey everyone, Chris Whiting here, and this is another episode of I've Got Something to Say. This week's episode, A Night to Remember. While I don't exactly obsess about death, it's fair to say I have more than a passing interest. So, when I was told in my first college speech class to pick a topic for my informative speech that everyone could relate to, I decided to do it on what happens to our bodies after we pass. I had thought about poop first. I mean, everyone relates to that. But this was in a time before things like the poo emoji or even the Everyone Poops book had brought the scatological into the mainstream. Back in these days, poo was pretty taboo in mixed company, let alone in academic circles. So I went and I interviewed the local mortician and got the skinny on how he embalmed the recently deceased. It was a good conversation and ended with him offering me the apartment above the funeral home for free. In return, I'd be expected to go pick up cadavers outside of normal business hours when the mortician had gone home. I politely turned down the offer. One of the true regrets in my life. Anyway, I wrote an informative speech all about embalming, and I was actually pretty proud of it. I worked hard on the speech, and working hard in school was not exactly my forte. I got good grades, but I came from the perspective of, what's the least amount of work I can do and still get an A? Actually learning something almost always took a backseat to gaming the system to get that A. One of the other regrets in my life. So it came time to give the speech, and it seemed to go over well with the class. This was later confirmed as I was leaving the class, and my professor asked me to stay after. He was the forensics squad coach, and he said he thought my speech would be good for college forensics competition. In fact, he would be happy to offer me a scholarship if I wanted to join the squad. Now I was intrigued. My immediate thought was, cool, I didn't know they offered full rides for forensics. It turns out the reality was slightly less lucrative than I'd hoped, and I was given $75 in the form of a personal check. I'm sure it violated NCAA rules somehow, but it also meant that I was technically a professional speaker. So I tidied up my speech and got ready to travel with the theater kids to my first meet. Now, the theater kids were certainly an eclectic group, and I got to know them quickly as all 10 of us shared one hotel room. The travel budget, it seemed, pulled from the same kitty as the scholarship budget. I bonded most quickly with a thespian named Rob. First of all, I'd ran into him in my astronomy class. He was a teaching assistant. I met him at our first extra credit stargazing event. He was responsible for writing down the names of everyone in attendance. If your name wasn't on the list, no extra credit for you. So everyone who went out stargazing made sure to stop and see Rob, and he was pretty easy to spot. He was tallish, thin, and looked a little bit like the Ichabod Crane from the old Disney cartoon. He'd always be the first one to point out and to poke fun at his large nose. If they don't like what's between my legs, I can always give 'em the nose, Rob would say. I sensed that underneath the outer shell of this self-deprecator was an equally adept self-loather. Takes one to know one, I guess. He was part of the D&D club, forensics, ROTC, and a madrigal singer at Renaissance festivals. You know, all the things that chicks dig. And man, did he ever want a girlfriend. I learned this because we developed a real friendship and became close. Close enough that he felt he could be vulnerable and tell me just how lonely he was and how inadequate he felt around women. All he asked was for me to listen, which I did. And close enough that I felt I could ask him to mark me as present for those extra credit stargazing sessions that I no longer attended, which he did. Win-win, I would later learn to call this type of arrangement. Then I got a call from Rob one Friday afternoon. He was excited. A girl named Dawn had agreed to go with him to a couple of parties that evening. He was nervous and wanted me to come along as a third wheel to keep things light and fun, keep the conversation going. Basically, he wanted her to be impressed that he had a cool friend. The fact that he was turning to me to play the role of cool friend said quite a bit about where Rob was in the social pecking order. And what kind of parties had Rob been invited to, I wondered. Rob picked me up first in his big-as-a-whale Chrysler. He was nervous, and I gave him a pep talk as we headed to pick up Dawn. Dawn was nice enough when we picked her up. She was cute, really cute, and full of laughter. I could see why Rob was smitten, and it was also clear that my pep talk did nothing to calm his nerves. He was a fumbling wreck, obviously thinking she was out of his league. So I tried to facilitate some conversation, but keep the focus on him. Things like, "Hey, Don, did you know Rob took 5th place in prose last weekend?" Or, "Rob's the teaching assistant in my astronomy class. I wouldn't have an A if it wasn't for him." She didn't seem to care too much. I was glad to leave the awkwardness of the car and see what kind of people would be at a party Rob was invited to. Turns out it was populated with other theater types, several foreign students studying business and engineering, and a fair amount of grad students. The conversations were fun and elevated from the typical college party conversations. The humor was smart, and I was feeling kind of proud of myself that I could sort of keep up with these people, as they were most certainly much smarter than me. Where had they been hiding? This school only had 7,000 students. How had I not found out these interesting people were attending the same college as me? Socially, I was on fire that night, really cracking off some great zingers. I was intentionally staying away from Rob and Dawn, giving him some space to woo her, hoping he'd later tell me that sparks were flying, emotions were running high. As we left the first party to head to the next one, I began to get a bad feeling in my stomach. Rob was driving, Dawn next to him in the front seat, and me in the back seat. I sat behind Dawn, but she was turned completely around to talk directly to me the entire ride. The fact that seatbelts were entirely optional in those days made this possible. Rob said nothing and just drove stone-faced. Uh-oh. Dawn was crushing on me. I could feel it. At the next party, I stayed completely away from Rob and Dawn. At one point, I retired, alone, to the kitchen to get something. Dawn obviously saw an opportunity, followed me in, grabbed me, and planted a big old smackaroo right on my lips. I was caught off guard, and for the first time that evening, speechless. She then told me, rather graphically, what sort of things we should do before the night was through. I told her that Rob really liked her, and I couldn't do that to him. She considered it, then kissed me again and tried to take my shirt off. I pulled away as she scratched my back, hard. I had scratch marks for nearly a week. She said she wasn't dating Rob, had never let him on, and so I didn't need to worry. She was right, of course, except for the part that I didn't need to worry. I just couldn't do that to the poor guy. The awkwardness of the ride to the parties earlier in the evening was laughable compared to the awkwardness of the ride home. Rob again was completely silent. Dawn was very tipsy at this point and not silent. When he dropped her off, she turned to face me and said, "I'm going to give this one more shot. Do you want to come up for a nightcap?" This had to curb stomp poor Rob's ego and masculinity. I politely said, "No, thank you," and she left. Now the awkwardness had reached a dizzying height. "Rob, I'm so sorry," I said. "Not your fault," he replied, staring straight ahead as he drove me home. He dropped me off at my dorm. I tried to apologize again, and having lost my social mojo from earlier in the evening, muttered something completely unintelligible. I went up to my dorm room as he took off for his. It was around midnight when I got home. I started watching TV to decompress from the weirdness of the evening, and it was working until. About 2 hours later, there was a knock at my door. I sort of thought or hoped it might be Dawn. I mean, how many times can a guy say no? I looked through my peephole to see Rob. I opened the door and could see he had changed his clothes into what must have been sleeping shorts and a ratty t-shirt. He'd been rather dapper earlier in the night, probably overdressed, though, in a blazer and slacks for college house parties. I asked him to come in. It was 2 a.m, and he was crying, hard, outside my room in the hallway. This was not something I wanted my dorm mates to see. He declined my invitation. "No, I can't stay, but I have something I have to share with you." "Okay," I said, knowing full well that whatever he was going to share was not going to be okay. Rob explained that when he first told Dawn he was a madrigal singer, she seemed interested in that. Really? Anyway, he'd written her a song, hoping to share it with her if the night went well. Since it went monumentally wrong, and he didn't share it with her, he felt that he needed to share it with me. Really? And then, with no further ado, he started into the love song he wrote for the girl who had gathered my DNA under her fingernails right after she full-on mouth-kissed me 3 hours earlier in a stranger's kitchen. I was stunned. Mortified, really. Here was Rob, crying, singing a love song to me while standing in the hallway outside my dorm room door. Two things stood out. One, he had a really good voice. And two, my God, that song was long. I don't remember any of the verses, but I will never forget the chorus, which he must have come back to at least a dozen times as he sobbed his way through his epic ballad. For I am your knight in shining armor. Whene'er you're in need, I'll be there on my steed. Each time he came back around again to the chorus, I prayed it would be the last. And what seemed like 45 minutes later, it was. Then he left, heading back down to his car, and I went back to watch another 2 hours of TV to decompress from the new leveled-up weirdness of the evening. Rob and I remained friendly after the serenade, but he wasn't at school much longer after that. I don't think he graduated, and I don't know what happened to him. Dawn? Well, I never saw her again. In putting this story together, I searched the internet trying to find out where Rob had landed in life. Has he scored a fair lady? Does he now have a steed? I guess it will remain a mystery because, alas, I can find no trace of him after 1989. So, since it doesn't happen often enough in real life, I'm just going to choose to believe that he is living happily ever after. So that's this edition of I've Got Something to Say. Big thanks, as always, to KCTK Radio and Paul for producing and putting this together. And as always, if you have questions, thoughts, or comments, reach out to me. You can find me at cwhiting11@gmail.com. Until next time.